right. Welcome everyone to our Spring Research Update webinar, where we review our most recently funded research projects and give you a highlight of how your precious research dollars are being put to work. I'm Susan Hedstrom, the Executive Director for FPWR, and I will be your moderator today. Joining me to give you all of the details of our funded projects is Dr. Theresa Strong, FPWR's Director of Research Programs, and mom to Daniel, who has PWS. As always, we would love to hear from you, so please feel free to submit questions to Theresa and I through the chat, and we will reserve time at the end of the presentation to answer as many of your questions as possible. Theresa, I will hand over our virtual microphone to you.
Great. Thank you, Susan, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm really pleased to tell you about some of the research that's ongoing and some of the new projects that we're going to fund. I usually put a picture of Daniel here, but I thought it would be good to put all of your cute kids instead this time. So our agenda today is I'm going to give a brief update on some of the ongoing PWS research activities, talk about some of the outcomes, the recent outcomes from previously supported grant projects, and then spend most of the time describing the new grants that were funded in the spring. So these are grants that were submitted at the end of last year. And as Susan mentioned, happy to answer any questions or comments that you might have about the specifics of the projects or overall things about PWS research. Just a reminder about our mission, which is to eliminate the challenges of PWS through the advancement of research and therapeutic development. Always good to remember the mission as we progress. So just wanted to start out by reminding you that there are a number of clinical trials that are ongoing, that are active, or have recently been completed. The ones that are shown in yellow here are the ones that are currently recruiting. So there are some that are pharmaceutical based, like Harmony and Radius and Aardvark. And then there are some at academic centers. So Montefiore's got a clinical trial on oxytocin, also on CBDV. And University of Alberta, for our Canadian friends, has a fiber intervention. So there are several recruiting, as I mentioned. There are a couple that have finished at least a portion of their trial and are sort of awaiting next steps, both Levo, which has completed a phase 3 and is working on next steps, and Soleno, which has also completed a phase 3 and is discussing with the FDA what data is needed to apply for a new drug application. We heard today, unfortunately, that Saniona, which was getting ready to start a phase 2/3 clinical trial of their drug Tesomet, is actually going to be putting that trial on hold and closing their US office. So they're looking for partners to continue the development. So it is I'm not big on finance, but my understanding is it is a rough time in the financial markets for biotech. And so some of the companies are having to, figure out how best to move forward, potentially through partnerships. So, these are just challenges given all that is going on in the world. So, in light of those challenges, I would just remind us there are some things we can't control. Obviously, the economics, everything that's going on in the world, but there are some things that we can control. It's very expensive for both the biotech and the academic sites to have trials open but not filled. So if you're considering going into a clinical trial, I would just encourage you to try to, and I know we all have a lot on our plates, but try to put that at the top of the list. And you can use our clinical trials page to learn more about each of the clinical trials, where they're located, what the inclusion criteria are, so you can see what your loved one with PWS is eligible for. Contact the site and get information about, whether the trial makes sense for you. So, excuse me, we have information on that page about clinical trials, what questions to ask, what you should be looking for. We have a sign up so that you'll get alerts when new clinical trial sites open. And we have all of the active and recruiting sites up there so that you can learn more about each. So again, If our community is going to get new treatments, we have to be the ones that will consider enrolling in clinical trials. We also want to mention a development this year that FPWR is driving, and that is using vagus nerve stimulation for PWS. And this project is the extension of a small project that FPWR funded a couple of years ago that Tony Holland ran. And it was looking at vagus nerve stimulation as a potential treatment for some of the challenging behaviors we see in PWS. So specifically temper outbursts, which many of our adolescents and adults experience, and it can be really stressful for the family. It can be limiting for the person with PWS. So really challenging all around. Dr. Holland had shown in a small clinical trial that use of vagus nerve stimulation, and in this case, it's a device that is outside the body, so it's just a stimulation that goes through the ear, improved temper outbursts in PWS. So what we'd like to do now is really expand that in the US as well as potentially Europe, and get better sort of a larger data set, really carefully demonstrating whether or not this is an effective therapy, with the ultimate goal of having it available to our families. So we ask that you join us on May 11th. We're going to talk in more detail if this is something that is of interest to you. This is something, again, that FPWR is initiating, and you know, we're glad to be guided by some of the world's experts on it, and there'll be a lot more to learn on that. I also want to mention, because this is something that is near and dear to many of our hearts, you know, coping with PWS can be really challenging for caregivers. And we also know that when our caregivers, moms and dads, are really stressed, they may not be in the place they need to be to deal with their child with PWS. So one way to make the entire family happier is to practice ways to reduce stress and learn coping mechanisms. So we have provided funding to a group at Purdue University that is going to be looking at some different interventions for caregivers, and then measuring how it impacts families and you know, what the benefit is. So they're recruiting now for the summer, and they'll have different approaches that they're going to be using. And I would encourage you to contact them and learn more about that opportunity. I also always like to mention the Global PWS Registry. This is a great resource for our community, and it has been helpful in so many things, helping us better understand all of the challenges that occur in PWS, supporting the development of clinical trials, and improvements in the standard of care. So thank you to everyone who is a member of the Global PWS Registry. I would encourage you to update your records on a regular basis, like every 6 months or so. If you have any questions about navigating through that, if you want to set up an appointment so that you're kind of forced to go in and do it, please contact us, and we will help you walk through the different surveys and make sure that those get done. The Global PWS Registry has now been active since 2015, I believe. And because of that, and because all of you in the community have been so great about adding your data to it, we are really starting to be able to pull that data, analyze it, and provide some new insights into PWS that really weren't possible before. So just in the last year, we've published a paper on the incidence of strabismus, which is very common in PWS. Surgery from strabismus is much more common in the PWS population compared to the typical population, and even having to redo the surgery is more common. So we got that insight because about 800 or 900 of you provided information about strabismus. We have just published something from the Path for PWS study. So about 650 of you are involved in the Path for PWS study, which collects data through the global registry. And we looked at what are the risk factors for developing blood clots. That paper has just been published. In addition, we've looked at some of the psychiatric side and behavioral side effects of PWS. We looked at suicidality, that's, you know, talk of suicide, suicide attempts. We found basically that it is the frequency of that kind of behavior is not too different than the general population, but the characteristics are slightly different. So it happens a little bit older generally, and it happens in the typical population, it's more in females. In our population, it's a little bit more even. And so understanding those kinds of things is important so that, you know, we can catch things early. We can talk to our doctors about that. And finally, neuropsychiatric features, a study led by Dr. Dewis at Colorado, looking using the registry data to understand the associations between some of the behaviors and characteristics of PWS. And a really interesting finding, I think, from this paper was that for individuals who had disrupted sleep, they had much higher incidences of some of the more challenging behaviors, anxiousness, OCD behaviors, mental health problems. So those seem to be quite associated. And I'll tell you another study that comes to a similar conclusion, suggesting that we need to do more work on understanding how disrupted sleep impacts all of these aspects of PWS. Also wanted to mention a new survey in the registry that is being led by investigators from our PWS Clinical Initiative Collaborative, which is a collaboration of about 25 clinical sites in North America. And they are really, this study is being led by Dr. Sani Roy, along with Dr. Dewis and Dr. Scheinman and others. They're really interested in understanding the complications of feeding tubes in our babies with PWS. But this study is really for all individuals with PWS, all ages, because from the babies, we want to understand, you know, what the current practice is, what kind of feeding tubes are currently being used. From the older individuals, we want to understand what were the long-term complications, if there were any, from feeding tube use. So this information will be used to guide the development of best practices for feeding tubes in babies with PWS. Many of you have completed this. Thank you very much. A shout out though, we especially need the younger parents to be adding their data. So the investigators would like to get about 400 responses kind of across the ages. And so we need everybody, but especially the 0 to 4s. If you have any questions about completing the surveys, if you need any help, again, please just reach out and we will walk you through the process. So I'll turn now to the grant program, which is our biggest program as far as providing funding to the academic, usually the academic community, to advance PWS research, everything from basic science all the way through small clinical trials. And this program has been active since 2003 when FPWR was started. And since then, we've supported more than 200 projects. And that investment has led to the development of a lot of resources that are used across the PWS scientific community, to new insights to PWS, to clinical trials, to the VNS study, as I mentioned. So all kinds, it's really a potpourri of scientific discovery and therapeutic advancement. So these are some of the papers that have come out recently from FPWR funded projects. So I'll just mention a couple of these. We have supported Dr. Godler to develop a newborn screening because we think it's important that every baby with PWS be identified as soon as possible after birth so that they can have access to new therapies. So he published a study of more than 15,000 newborns using the technology to show that this is a feasible approach to detecting PWS. And there are follow-up studies ongoing now in the US based on that. Dr. Elizabeth Dykins and her team supported a project asking individuals with PWS what they wanted to see treated. So we have a lot of data from caregivers showing that, we caregivers think that anxiousness in PWS, sleep issues, and mostly hyperphagia really need attention treatments. But the FDA asked us, does that match with what individuals with PWS say? And so Dr. Dykens led a study and asked people with PWS what they wanted to see treated, and it's very reassuring that they also want to see the same aspects of PWS treated. It's nice to have that out in the published literature, though, and for the FDA to look at. We also, a couple of basic science studies came out looking at one of the genes in the region, MAGEL2, and what its function is and what its role is in social development. So the maternal pup, in this case, because they're mice, interaction and vocalization, and how loss of this gene leads to reduced social interaction between mom and baby, which is potentially relevant to PWS, and which provides a model now that you can maybe look at whether an intervention in the pup will improve that social interaction. Again, Dr. Holland commenting on the VNS potential for PWS, and this new paper from Dr. Bearden looking at neurobehavioral dimensions of PWS and predicting what might be show that you're at higher risk for developing mental health issues. And similar to Dr. Dewis's work, but this was a different approach, but came to the same conclusion that individuals with sleep disturbances seem to be at higher risk. This is, again, is important because we want to be able to identify the highest risk individuals and then intervene as early as possible to reduce, all of those unwanted behaviors and mental health concerns. So you can keep up to date. We try to, some of these are very new. Dr. Bearden's paper just came out recently, so it's not, I haven't gotten to blog it yet, but will very soon. But you can keep up to date on the outcomes of these different projects on our website. We try to do the blogs on as many articles as we can, but the projects also have links to the actual papers. So that's sort of, what has come out from previously funded projects. And now we'll turn to, oh no, we won't. Before we turn to the new projects funded, I just want to mention that we're really excited in 2022, hopefully to get together in person finally after a couple of years hiatus. Mention for those who are able and willing to go to Ireland, IPSO, the International PWS Organization, is having a meeting in July. FPWR is going to be presenting data on our natural history study, also comparing the natural history to DCCR, Soleno's drug, and also a new measure of anxiousness and distress, the PADQ questionnaire. And then in the fall, we're really excited that FPWR is going to be holding both a research and a family conference. So we hope to see you there. It'd be great to get together. So now we will turn to the new projects that were funded. Again, these are funded in the spring, submitted last fall. We had a really strong group of grants funded. And so because of you, all of you who have spent time doing fundraising, we were able to fund a number of grants that are again, span the spectrum, everything from very basic science all the way through to clinical trials. So I'll break this up and go through them now. The first set is the foundational knowledge. So we support this kind of work because it helps us develop therapies. You can't develop therapies if you don't excuse me, if you don't understand what is going wrong or different in PWS. And so these are the studies that provide the basis that will guide us to more efficient therapeutic development. So there are 4 that fall under this category. Again, very basic genetics and molecular biology. So I'll try to be gentle as I go through these. Just as a reminder, this is the PWS region of chromosome 15, and all of the genes shown in blue are the ones that are lost regardless of whether you have PWS by deletion, imprinting mutation, or UPD, they're not expressed in individuals with PWS. And so a lot of these studies are really aimed at understanding what do those genes normally do and what happens when they're missing or inactive. And we focus specifically, a lot of the studies focus on MAGEL2 and SNORD116 because they seem to be particularly important genes in this region. So the first study in this group is actually the second year of funding for Dr. Tay, who is at Mass General, and he has been developing iPS cells or stem cells that have deletions of like the big deletion in PWS, the smaller deletion in PWS, and then individual genes. And he's done all of this on the same genetic background, so the same cell line using CRISPR technology. And that allows him to do a really robust comparison of what happens when you're missing SNORD116, what happens when you're just missing MAGEL2, what happens when you're missing all of them. So he has been working in the Talkowski lab, and that lab does a lot of this kind of work for all kinds of neurodevelopmental disorders, which is actually great because then you can compare PWS to other neurodevelopmental disorders. And the goal here is to characterize the cellular properties of these PWS stem cells after they are differentiated or encouraged to become like hypothalamic neurons in a dish. So they essentially take the stem cells, they feed them things to make them essentially turn into brain cells, and then they can study a PWS brain in a dish. So why are we excited about this study? This lab has some of the most advanced technologies for looking at overall global changes when you disrupt specific genes. And they have a pipeline that they send these cells through again, and they can compare to other neurodevelopmental disorders to see what's the same and different. And that's important because maybe there's some shared pathways and shared therapeutic avenues that we can pursue. This is a powerful resource for the entire PWS research community. So this lab has been great about sharing it with other researchers so they can do their studies. And ultimately, it may support the development of high throughput screening approaches. So if you define differences in the biochemistry or the electrical interaction of these neurons, then you may be able to screen drugs and see what restores it back to a more normal level. So the long-term goal of this study is to provide new cellular models for PWS to understand the changes that happen when we are missing those PWS genes and identify pathways, druggable pathways for new therapies. The second grant in this group is genetic determinants of behavioral, physical, and physiological characteristics of PWS. And this is Dr. Bochukova at University of London. And we know that there's a lot of variability in PWS symptoms, right? So some kids have a really hard time, some kids do better, some kids have lots of hyperphagia, some have less. So understanding how genes outside of the PWS region might impact those things is important to understand who's at highest risk for some of the clinical problems we see in PWS, and also for potentially defining ways to reduce the severity of some of these symptoms. So Soleno Therapeutics, as part of their DCCR trial, supported the development of a DNA resource from participants that is looking at DNA variants across the genome that might influence things like metabolism, behavior, and physical characteristics. And as part of this project, the research team who has expertise in this kind of genetic analysis is going to be looking at how those DNA variants influence these properties or these characteristics of PWS. So we're excited about this study because it leverages a very rich data set in and may use that data set to better understand why symptoms vary so widely in people with PWS. And that may lead to a more personalized medicine approach. So if you know when your child is young that they have a very high risk of developing scoliosis, you may, follow that more carefully than if they have lower risk, for example. Of course, everyone should follow scoliosis carefully, but it may give you some, additional screening that needs to be done, for example. So that, of course, would be beneficial for all of us to really understand the personalized medicine side of PWS, and it complements an ongoing study that FPWR is supporting that some of you are engaged in, and that is our genome project. So we are doing a similar study using a more comprehensive technique, whole genome sequencing. And one great thing about this project is the way that scientists normally identify variants that impact symptoms is they'll look at one set to do the identification and then use a different data set to confirm or not confirm whether that variant is at play. So by having both our genome project and this data set, we'll be able to do that. And both this research team and the research team that is doing the whole genome sequencing are really excited about the ability to do that. So our goal here is to deepen our understanding of the contributions of DNA variants outside the region to the complexity and severity of PWS symptoms and identify new targets for therapeutic intervention. The next molecular study is a study looking at the RNA, the gene SNORD116, and how it interacts with targets. So what is it normally doing? Who is it interacting with? And why, when we lose it, do we get the symptoms of PWS? We know SNORD116 is critical in PWS, and Dr. Good has shown that it interacts with another gene, NHLH2, and that gene is important in metabolism and obesity and energy balance. So with this project, she's going to look at that interaction in more depth, so she can really gain an understanding if this is like one of the genes that is really important in the manifestations of PWS. But she's also going to be developing an atlas of where and when SNORD116 is expressed throughout the development of the mouse brain. And that atlas will be very useful not only to her studies, but for everyone in the field. So this is, we get a little bit of extra with this grant, Dr. Good's own work, as well as the resource for the field. So we're excited because this may lead to a better understanding of how these two SNORD116 influences NHLH2, and also provide an atlas that it may be a resource for other investigators in the field. So that's Dr. Good's study. And the final one in this group of molecular studies is a study by Dr. von Taser, who is at Texas Tech University, and looking specifically at MAGEL2 and its role in the adaptive stress response. So Dr. von Taser is hypothesizing that MAGEL2, a gene that's lost in PWS, normally plays an important role in stress response. And by stress response here, I mean, we are talking about stress, but we're talking about also stressors like when an organism becomes sick, or when there's not enough nutrition, those kinds of stresses. Those stresses will trigger a stress response. And Dr. von Taser believes that MAGEL2 is really important in that stress response. And then in PWS, when you've lost MAGEL2, the ability of the body to respond to those stressors is decreased. So she is going to be investigating the role of MAGEL2 in the stress response along the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is this pathway of stress response in the body. And she'll be looking at that under conditions of stress to understand the normal function of MAGEL2. So we're excited about this study. It's an innovative and therapeutically relevant study for both Prader-Willi syndrome and Schaff-Yang syndrome, since MAGEL2 is lost in both of those syndromes. And by understanding the normal role of MAGEL2 in mediating stress, we can potentially determine new targets for therapy. This is also a nice study because it supports a new investigator. She was with Dr. Potts, who has done some of the seminal work on MAGEL2, and now she has her own lab. So the long-term goal of this study is to provide novel insight into the MAGEL2 molecular function to discover better therapeutic avenues for both PWS and Shaff-Yang syndrome. So Susan, I'll pause here if you're, and since that's, that's not all of the grants, but that's 4 sort of hardcore grants, and see if there are any questions that have popped up on those.
Thanks so much, Theresa. These already seem like some pretty, great grants that FPWR has selected for funding. Just as a reminder to all of our participants on the call today, if you do have questions, you're welcome to submit them through the Q&A. You just enter them in as a chat, and we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. Theresa, we did get one question earlier. I believe you may have addressed this somewhat, but could you perhaps tell us a bit more? How does the Genetic Determinants Project complement the Genome Project?
Yeah, so I think that the techniques are different. So in our genome project, we're using whole genome sequencing, which is the most comprehensive form of genetic analysis that we can do these days. It looks at the entire 3 billion base pairs of DNA and also looks for structural changes in that DNA. But the study that Soleno has, or the database that Soleno has generated, is also very comprehensive. It uses a different approach, SNP chips, and it looks at, it sort of tags 600,000 known genetic variants and looks specifically at those. So they are, again, they're complementary because some of the variants, obviously some of the variants are going to overlap, and it gives us an opportunity to analyze one data set and confirm things with another data set.
That sounds really interesting to me, because when talking to parents, there's always these questions of, is my child going to be more at risk for certain symptoms of PWS? It seems like this project may be able to get into a little bit of that. That's great. Why don't we go ahead and move on into the next group of projects? Thanks, Theresa.
Okay. Great. So the next group of projects are, I've called them translational studies. So these are studies in which we're defining new targets for PWS therapy and determining whether they are good targets for PWS therapies. So there's 3 in this group, and I'll just walk through them. The first one is a really interesting study, I think, from Dr. Ross at Albert Einstein, and she is looking at the integration of the cognitive challenges in PWS and the feeding challenges. So we know that abnormal appetite and altered cognition or behavior, including that cognitive rigidity that many of our loved ones with PWS have, they occur together. And she thinks that this may not be a coincidence, right? So they may be linked through neurons that express this particular type of receptor, melanocortin-4 receptor, in 2 different parts of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex and the hypothalamus. So she's going to use a PWS mouse model to investigate how that feeding behavior and cognitive flexibility are jointly regulated in these neurons. So we're excited about this study because it's using some cutting-edge neurobiology approaches to understand this link between cognitive symptoms and feeding behaviors in PWS. It's an interesting new pathway. Nobody has proposed this before, and it kind of makes a lot of sense at face value, but it'll be good to dig down into it and see how these circuits are connected. So, if these are found to be connected and co-regulated, that may provide an approach for looking for new drugs that would impact both at the same time. And we're also excited because this brings an excellent young investigator who has expertise in neurobiology into the PWS field. So the long-term goal of this study is to understand how cognitive function and feeding behavior are jointly regulated in the brain with the goal of identifying new druggable targets. The second project in this group is a study of a different but similar sounding receptor, the MC3R. And this is from Dr. Sweeney at University of Illinois. And the background to this is hypothalamic neurons express this protein AGRP, and that's it's a protein that promotes hunger. And there's some evidence that it's overactive in PWS. And neurons that express AGRP also express MC3R, this receptor that's important in feeding behavior. And this receptor hasn't been studied for as long or as in much detail as MC4R, but Dr. Sweeney and his colleagues have recently shown that it has a very important role in regulating feeding behaviors. And they've got a drug that targets MC3R and inhibits feeding in typical animals. And what he's doing here is seeing how that information applies to PWS. So is this a pathway, since we know the AGRP neurons are overactive in PWS, is this a particularly good pathway to target for PWS? So he'll be testing how PWS affects the activity patterns of these neurons in mice and determining whether this inhibitor of MC3R reduces feeding in a PWS mouse model. So we're excited about this because obviously a drug target that is particularly effective in PWS would be great. The preliminary data is promising. It's a new pathway that might have relevance to PWS. And again, it's another new investigator, really good neurobiologist studying PWS for the first time. So the long-term goal of this project is to determine the mechanisms of altered AGRP neuron activity in PWS and provide the rationale or not of advancing MC3R antagonist compounds to clinical trials. And I think that's a really critical point with many of these projects. The goal here is to get a yes/no answer. Does this pathway make sense for PWS? Is it a better than, average, better than it is for obesity in the general population? Is it less effective than the general population? So just getting an idea of go, no go on some of these therapeutic avenues. The next project is a project from Dr. Yu at the University of Michigan, looking at the role of this gene FKBP5 in the MAGEL2 mice. So this is a great example of how a very basic science project can develop into a therapeutic project. So we funded Dr. Yu along with her mentor, Dr. Malcolm Lowe, I think 2 years ago, to look at what are the differences between a PWS mouse brain and a typical mouse brain. And they did that in very detailed, using all of the most advanced genetic approaches, and found this one pathway overactive in PWS. So this FKBP5 is overactive in the PWS mouse. And again, this is a pathway that's important in stress response. So that kind of harkens back to Dr. Fontaser's project. And they hypothesized that this overactivity is really a necessary step for the development of the PWS characteristics. The good news about this pathway is there's already a drug that impacts, that reduces the activity. And so in this follow-up project, Dr. Yu is going to test whether if you reduce the activity of this pathway, if you recover some of the, or improve some of the abnormalities in the PWS mouse. So we're excited about this study because they did a great job in their first year of funding. They came up with this potential pathway, and now they're advancing it to looking whether there's translational potential. This is, again, a young investigator who has been working with Dr. Lowe, who is one of the leaders in the field and has been for many years, but it helps set up her research project with the long-term goal, again, of providing preclinical rationale for either advancing this as a potential PWS therapeutic or deciding that it is not the path to go down. So Susan, again, I'll take a break. We just have 3 more to go, so we're getting there, but to see if there's any questions on these or if I should just keep plowing ahead.
Sure. So in that last project that you were discussing, you mentioned that there's a known drug for that pathway. Is that a drug already FDA approved?
I don't believe it's FDA approved. It's been tested in a lot of animal models. It is being developed for some other psychiatric conditions. And so there's a lot of data on it, but it's not yet available.
So this drug is going to be tested in this project in an animal model. How long could it be before it's available to be tested in humans?
Well, I think if the animal model data is good, that would provide a strong rationale. And then it would just be a matter of, pulling together an investigational new drug application and running that by the FDA. So, the next step is kind of a bigger step where we would probably look for a pharmaceutical partner. But the fact that this drug is being developed for other more common conditions, can be a real advantage because some of the larger companies may have an interest in seeing it developed as well.
That's great. Very exciting. Let's move on to those last few projects.
All right. The last couple are projects that are sort of closer to the clinic or in the clinic. So advancing PWS therapeutics. And the first one is really a genetic therapy study. So Dr. Blewett, for those of you who have are familiar with FPWR, we've funded Dr. Blewett before. She has a really interesting strategy for genetic therapy where she is knocking down this protein SMID-D1 as a way to activate the silent maternal chromosome in PWS. So when you reduce SMID-D1, you get expression, for example, of MAGEL2 and the other protein coding genes on chromosome 15. So that's a really interesting approach, and other funding, and with other funding that she's got from other agencies, she's continuing to advance that project. But it's an incomplete activation. And so one thing she really needs to understand is, how does the chromosome change when SMID-D1 is inactivated? And so that's what this project is. It's really to gain an understanding of how the landscape of the chromosome changes with and without SMID-D1 as a step towards doing sort of the most effective gene activation that we can in the region. So the goal here is to determine the chromosomal landscape on the maternal chromosome that every person with PWS has. And if you'll recall, what we're trying to do is activate the genes. All of those blue genes are sitting on the maternal chromosome. They're just inactive. So we're trying to unsilence them and understand how that changes when this particular regulator is missing. So this study uses cutting-edge genomic technologies to optimize a promising approach for PWS genetic therapy, which is a good thing, obviously. In addition, it should give us some more insight into the chromosomal landscape of that region, which would be important for any genetic therapy approach. And you may recall that FPWR is supporting several different approaches to doing gene activation because we don't know which one is going to work the best. But this information will provide insight for anyone who is doing genetic therapy for PWS. So it has a high translational potential, not only for this project, but for other genetic therapy projects. So the long-term goal of this study is to pave the way for more efficient maternal gene activation to treat PWS. And now we have a really interesting project that is from Chris Prelo at GE Research. And the scientists at GE Research have developed an ultrasound approach to modulate targets in the brain. So basically, this approach uses ultrasound on peripheral organs, so like on the liver, and through that ultrasound and probably through the VNS is sending signals up to the brain. So again, we know the VNS, the vagus nerve, is very important in PWS, and this is providing signals from the outside up into the brain. And what they've shown is that they can use this technology to improve diabetes and obesity in a number of different animal models. And so they're really interested in seeing whether this might be a viable treatment for PWS, and we're interested in that as well. And so we're partnering with them actually on this project where we're providing some funds, GE is providing some funds, and Dr. Proilo is going to look at how this technology can be applied to PWS. So the goal of the project is to test if ultrasound stimulation can modulate the brain, so the neuropeptide secretion and the GI peptide secretion in PWS, and provide increased satiety, reduce adiposity, reduce the fat, as well as potentially impact learning and behavior in PWS. And the ultimate goal is to determine in the mouse model if there is, again, a basis for moving forward into humans. So we're excited about this study because there's some really very intriguing preliminary data in non-PWS models of obesity. They just published a paper looking in mice, rats, and pigs using this technology to improve glucose homeostasis and reduce obesity in all of these animal models. They've also done some initial trials in humans with general obesity. So this is potentially a non-invasive way of having a therapeutic effect, and it's a partnership opportunity for us. So the long-term goal of this study, if successful, is to move it into a clinical trial to test, what benefits it might have in PWS. And the final study that we're going to be funding in this round is from Dr. Deepan Singh, who many of you know. He's a child psychiatrist in New York. And he had the idea of potentially using bright light therapy on individuals with PWS to improve daytime sleepiness and behaviors. And as I mentioned, we are seeing, and many of you would have and have predicted that individuals who have the most disrupted sleep in PWS tend to be those who have the most behavioral problems and potentially psychiatric problems as well. So trying to restore good circadian rhythm, get good sleep at night, awakeness during the day is really important. We have Harmony Biosciences, of course, is looking at pitolisant, which may be helpful in that regard, but it would also be beneficial to have a non-drug approach that could either replace or complement any drug-based approach. So this study will look at bright light therapy, which has been shown to improve behavior and sleepiness and some other conditions like dementia or bipolar disease, and evaluate whether it is helpful in children with PWS. So it's going to be bright light therapy, and then look at daytime sleepiness, look at behavior, look at some other outcomes. So this is potentially a safe and effective way of improving sleep, behavior, and mood in PWS, all of which would be a very good thing. It's going to be an entirely remote study. So anyone, I believe in the US, can participate. So you'll get a bright light and then you'll do bright light therapy. The person with PWS will sit with the bright light, like at breakfast, for example, for I believe it's 30 minutes a day. And then there'll be some assessments of whether that improves daytime sleepiness and behaviors. So the long-term goal of this study is to determine if bright light therapy improves daytime sleepiness and behavior in PWS. And this is a study that will be opening in the next couple of months. So Dr. Singh will have to get IRB approval, but we're excited to fund this study. So I guess I'll hold questions to the end, since that's our last group. I'll mention, as we get into 2022, what are we looking for? Well, there was a slowdown in research activity. We see that picking up again. We're excited about that, as well as the return of in-person meetings. As I mentioned, there are some challenges in the biotech sector generally that we can't control, but we are pleased that we still are seeing the startup of several new clinical trials. And to the extent that we can get those enrolled and completed, that would be extremely helpful. We'll also be looking for what are the next steps with Levo and Soleno's drugs. And hopefully those things will get resolved in the near future. new insights into PWS biology, new initiatives from the PWS Clinical Investigation Collaborative. Again, anything you can do to provide data in the registry that will help those clinicians, better take care of our kids would be great. We'll be wrapping up the path for PWS with the last round of data entry into the natural history study. I'm so grateful to everybody who has participated in the path for PWS study. We've gotten so much fantastic data that we will be sharing with you about the serious medical events that are sending our kids to the hospital, about the medications that everyone is taking, about, what are the challenges that are the medical challenges that our kids are facing. And we look forward to continued activity of the clinical trial consortium, again, looking for ways to smooth the pathway so that we have the most efficient drug and therapy development that we can, so that we can get new therapies to our kids as soon as possible. So I just want to thank everybody who supports FPWR, supports it financially, supports it with, submitting things to the registry, participating in clinical trials. There's so many ways that you can support, you can and do support our community, that we really appreciate it. So I'll stop there and Susan, see if we've got any questions.
Theresa, thank you so much for making these projects understandable. Some of these projects are pretty
hardcore.
But listening to you describe them makes them so much more easy to comprehend. And I just have, just a comment to say, this bright light therapy project sounds really intriguing. We've been looking at past data. We know a lot of our loved ones with PWS are on multiple drugs, up to 5 in some instances at fairly young ages. My own son is one of those. So having a therapy that we could try that is not going to interact with our existing cocktail is really appealing to me, as a mother. So I'm looking forward to seeing that trial get started, and hopefully, let's cross our fingers that it's beneficial for our loved ones. One more treatment in our resource bag.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And as you say, I mean, there are other drugs, pitolisant, for example, that is being trialed for this, but, we expect that not every person with PWS will, not every person may benefit from it. There may be reasons that they can't take it, and this may provide, something to add on or use instead. So we're excited about that.
Do we have an idea of when the eligibility criteria will be posted for that study?
Probably I would guess within the next 2 months. So they'll be submitting the IRB, and it usually takes a couple of months to get an approval. And then we'll get it'll be on our web. You'll put it on our website. So, we'll share it with the community as soon as we have it. My recollection is that it's for children. So I think it's that 8 to 18 or, that age group to get started.
And it's fully remote. So how exciting is that? You don't have to travel anywhere. It'll just get mailed to you and you can follow the instructions.
Yes. And, there'll be remote visits. So there'll be Zoom calls, and, there'll be some data collection that you'll need to do, but you'll get the bright light, that you can use. And I believe everybody in the trial is going to get like a Fitbit to monitor their sleep and activity, that they will get to keep. So there'll be some little goodies to go along with the study.
We all love goodies. Quick question. You mentioned this ultrasound technology that FPWR is partnering with GE for. Has that technology been used in humans yet?
I believe it has been. I believe they've done, and I don't know, I don't think it's published, but I believe they've done like an early phase trial just in a small number of humans with typical obesity, so non-PWS. So they're laying the groundwork for sure to do it in different patient populations. So this will be an opportunity if it shows promise in PWS to sort of, I don't want to say get to the front of the line, because that will depend on, how GE is going to develop this, but definitely be in line for trying the technology on our population.
Yeah, well, that sounds exciting. And again, a non-drug treatment option that maybe become a resource for us. How about the project that you mentioned that Dr. Blewett is undertaking, what kind of model is she using in this project?
So she is currently using mostly cellular models because they're doing a lot of, like detailed chromosome analyses. They've also started looking, I believe, in mouse models for this approach. But most of the work that she's doing now is in cellular models of PWS, usually using the stem cells from individuals with PWS or Shaft-Yang syndrome, because she's specifically looking at activation of MAGEL2, which is affected both in PWS and Shaft-Yang syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As I think many of us know, supplements are commonly used, across the Prader-Willi community. Are there any documented or studies that have shown effectiveness for specific supplements? And is this in the literature anywhere?
Well, actually, we're working with Dr. Andrea Hack right now and her students who are looking at registry data to understand, how supplements are being used in the population. Part of the registry is that we ask parents, like, did was this supplement helpful to your child? Or if you stopped the supplement, why did you stop it? Because it wasn't being effective or because there was some side effect? So with Dr. Hack, or Dr. Hack is looking at all that data with the idea of they'll be publishing that. So that will be a source of information. Her group has done a lot on nutrition and supplements in PWS. They have some, they have some papers published, which I can share, but are looking at that in more detail. And then we have funded a project in Canada to look at CoQ10 and its impact on muscle strength and activity in PWS. It has been extraordinarily slow to get that study up and going. There's apparently a lot of regulation, there's a lot of regulation everywhere, but, it has just taken a very long time. But we hoped and then COVID hit, right? So hopefully that study, which I believe is in Toronto, Dr. Tien, will be started soon, and we'll be able to have some hard data. The issue with supplements in many cases is that, people can just buy them. And so companies don't often put the funding into doing really well-controlled trials because they don't have to. So it's really up to our community to do those trials if we want to show efficacy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Theresa, for that information. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and keeping us up to date, or allowing us to keep you up to date on our research progress. I'd also like to thank our fundraisers and donors who are making this work possible. FPWR relies on our generous community of dedicated supporters in order to advance the most promising PWS research. And our success is only made possible by individuals like you who are taking action and supporting PWS research. Please consider joining us May 11th to learn more about an exciting new treatment for tantrums and disruptive behaviors that FPWR is advancing into a clinical trial later this year. This webinar will go into more details about this VNS for PWS study, and we hope that you'll join us then. Please have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.